Okay, this video is going to be very interesting. What I'm going to share with you is insights into how the gods and goddesses were destroyed. I'm going to tell you about what I know and understands what I think I know. So if I'm wrong, but then, well, I'm saying I'm not wrong. And so basically, this is my opinion, and I was told this by God. So God told me this, as hard as it is to believe, and it's likely you won't believe it. It's natural that you won't because it's hard to believe. I'll tell you about how the gods and goddesses died. First, let's talk about Artemis. Um, Artemis was the goddess of the hunt, became later the goddess of the hearth. She was the brother of Apollo, the sun god. Excuse me. He was also a god of the sun. But there's a difference between Apollo, the sun god, and Apollo, the god of the sun, because Zeus is the god of the sun, and the sun is Apollo, and Apollo is the sun god. So basically, Zeus's title is god of the sun, and ultimately it was an official title, but ultimately being the sun god, you were the son, not the father. So now all the goddesses were murdered and killed off, except for Athena. So, and now if I'm wrong, they are hiding and acting dead. So what I tell you is, my information that I have is that the only surviving goddess that really survived was Athena. All the other goddesses for the feminine were all destroyed. So let's talk about how they were all destroyed. Artemis was likely destroyed by attempting to demand to Agamemnon the sacrifice of his daughter. When Zeus had forbid human sacrifices to all the gods and goddesses, he said, "I forbid human sacrifice. You will not do it. If you do it, you will. If you insist on anyone sacrificing a person, you'll pay with your life. Basically, you better not go against my will." Ultimately, Zeus absolutely forbid human sacrifice, and there used to be human sacrifice, but he forbid it at a certain point. Now, Artemis was a goddess that told she didn't want Agamemnon, who got his whole fleet ready. She didn't want Agamemnon to go to Troy and destroy it. She was trying to protect Troy with her brother Apollo, the sun god, who was also a god of the sun, his father. And Apollo was trying to protect Troy too. He was a protecting presence on the beaches of Troy. It was the intent of Artemis and Apollo to protect Troy from being sacked. So Artemis started out right away, and she told Agamemnon that she first convinced Poseidon, the god of the sea, who was Zeus's brother, to stay the winds, to take the winds away, so that the fleet can't sail. And the fleet was stuck in the harbor, ready to sail off to Troy for battle, and they had all the men on board with all the supplies and weapons, and they were ready to go. And ultimately, there was no wind. The wind died down to a complete stop. So the entire fleet of thousands of ships were sitting in the harbor, ready to go, and couldn't go. So this started happening for a couple of days. Ultimately, Agamemnon was very worried. We're ready to go. Our supplies are being used up, and we didn't even leave the harbor yet. And these ships and these men are getting antsy. Now, the men, after a while, were starting to be like, why is there no wind? So it started, the morale was in question of the whole entire fleet. They couldn't sail. So Artemis had Poseidon stay the winds, and then went to Agamemnon and said, "You have to sacrifice your daughter if you want to have winds to go to Troy." Now, what Artemis's intent is to cause Agamemnon to follow the will of his god. Now, Agamemnon was following Zeus, Zeus was Agamemnon's god, and he was the king of the Achaeans and what would become later the Greeks. He was king over lots of things, the Danaans and over many. He was king of kings. So Artemis wanted to stop the fleet from ever leaving the harbor, and how she did it was she intended to tell him, "You have to sacrifice your daughter." Now, ultimately, Zeus had forbidden human sacrifice, so and he absolutely forbid it at punishment of death. If if you're going to die if you have a human sacrifice, and ultimately, she expected that Agamemnon would do the will of his god Zeus, and he did. Agamemnon was always doing exactly what Zeus wanted. He was always trying to fulfill his duties to Zeus because he was a very dedicated king. He was a king of kings, and but there was a problem. Agamemnon spent over a year trying to get his fleet ready. It took a whole year to get thousands of ships ready and assemble hundreds of thousands, like 100,000 men. Like ultimately, there's a largest fleet to ever sail, and ultimately, it took a year to prepare for it. So Agamemnon spent so much time and money and resources into starting this endeavor to go to Troy to fight when he had thousands of ships literally out there on the harbor and the wind stayed. He was, and now he finds out Artemis. He gets a message from the high priest of Artemis saying the winds have been stayed because you have to sacrifice your daughter if you want winds. She intended for Agamemnon to do the will of Zeus and say, well, then we can't go. If human sacrifice is forbidden, how am I going to sacrifice my daughter? Zeus forbid it. Certainly I can't sacrifice my daughter. So then we can't even leave. So what Artemis intended was for Agamemnon to realize the truth. That in fact, if the fact is he has to sacrifice his daughter to get winds, he's not going to get winds because he's not going to go against Zeus. Zeus is his god. So ultimately, the unfortunate thing is, during this time, Zeus had his high priest trying to get information from Zeus, and ultimately Zeus wasn't telling him everything. Why? Because maybe Zeus was somehow in on this whole thing, letting some things happen and allowing things to go down. So basically, Agamemnon did not have the right information. He was not able to get information directly from Zeus. Maybe he prayed to him and ultimately didn't get the right answers he needed. He didn't have the right information. Ultimately, all he knew was, I had spent a whole year and it is the will of Zeus to fight this war. Don't tell me it's not. So we're going to go. And ultimately, then if we have to sacrifice, Agamemnon thought it's on Artemis. Meaning if I have to sacrifice my daughter, it's against Zeus's will. And if I have to do it, it is Zeus's will that we do it. So I'm going to, and he didn't have the information. If Zeus could have came to him and told him, like you can't go against my will, but he didn't do that. Meaning he left it to Agamemnon to make a decision. And Agamemnon's decision was, it's going to be on the goddess Artemis if she does this. If she forces me to sacrifice my daughter, it's going to be her fault. She'll have to pay for it. So Zeus won't punish me. He'll punish her. And ultimately he was right. So but he decided to go against the will of Zeus. And also because he was doing the will of Zeus. So Artemis bluffed him into hopefully not going, because he would have to realize that he can't sacrifice his daughter, but he decided he was going to do it and blame it on her. And so he agreed to trick his daughter into coming to the place, telling her that she was going to marry Achilles. And so she was going to marry Achilles. Yeah, and even Achilles found out about it, but it was a lie. It was to get her to come to where they were going to put her on our sacrifice altar and kill her. So he tricked his daughter and lied to her and said, honey, come over, you're going to marry Achilles. And Achilles found out about this while she was on the way. And he also went into trying to figure out, what? I'm not marrying her. And so he went towards that direction too. He was trying to figure out, well, why is the rumors got spread. So they sacrificed the daughter. And it is said in the story that at the last minute, Artemis may have intervened and stopped the sacrifice by taking her and throwing a deer in her place, so that in fact they didn't sacrifice her, they sacrificed a deer. That would have been if Artemis saved her, because understand that Artemis couldn't allow her to actually get sacrificed. Artemis knew this, which meant that Artemis was telling Agamemnon what she was telling him to bluff him into trying to actually hopefully realize that he can't do it, or he'll go against the will of Zeus, so he can't go, and he should realize this. It's over with. Don't even try it. But it was a bluff to make him give up, and he wouldn't give up. So he just said, it's going to be your fault, is what he reasoned. And it truly was going to be her fault. So basically, at the last second, if Artemis decided to rescue her and put a deer in her place, then Artemis wouldn't be in her place. And Artemis did not know this. So understand, Artemis's duty was to rescue her. Do not let her die, actually. Even though I told him that, I'm not going to go against the will of my dad. I can't tell him that. So ultimately she had a duty to save her, not let it actually go through with it. And so it says in the story that she may have saved her and replaced her with a deer. So they actually sacrificed a deer, not her. And she got taken by the goddess and taken up somewhere else. So out of there. And otherwise, Artemis died in her place. Meaning, if the sacrifice took place, Zeus was to say, Agamemnon shouldn't go against my will. So he shouldn't even go to Troy. He should realize he can't do it because he can't sacrifice his daughter. But if he decides to blame it on her, it is going to be her fault since she's the one who's demanded it. She has no right to demand it because I already forbid it. So ultimately, Artemis would be in big trouble if she let it happen. So she either rescued her or she was killed in her place, which meant if they actually sacrificed his daughter, then Zeus said Artemis is going to die. The goddess Artemis would be put to death for going against the will of her father. Zeus was fed up with his daughters and about to kill everyone. Understand the Trojan conflict at this time was Zeus was mad at his wife Hera. He threatened to kill Minerva, his daughter, called her a vixen goddess, and said she was bad and evil. And the women of Troy were terrible, evil creatures. They did bad things. And ultimately, they were very evil behaving. We could describe that, and I could tell you about it later. Artemis, so understand that Artemis may have died on the altar in the place of Agamemnon's daughter if she didn't save him. And if she did save him, she disappears from the story. And so the fact is, she does disappear from the story. Artemis is not mentioned as an active part of the whole Iliad. Throughout the Iliad, it's Minerva and Athena that is doing all the things that goddesses do. Artemis kind of disappeared from the picture. Eris disappeared from the picture. Eris was murdered by Athena. In the story of the Iliad, okay. So Artemis may have died because what she did is actually transgress her father's orders. Not to you'll be the one on the. He didn't say this to her, but he forbid her utterly. He said, "You're going to be the one sacrificed daughter. If you let her get killed, you're going to die." So ultimately, Zeus was that mad at his kids. He threatened to throw Minerva and Hera off Mount Olympus, literally killing them. He told them both, if you keep pissing me off, if you keep going against my will, I'm letting you try to force Troy into some submission. So Zeus was allowing the war of Troy to go down. He loved the Trojans. Zeus liked the Trojan men. They were his favorite. So understand that the Zeus approved of the ego and the egos, because at that time they followed God utterly. And so the Trojan men were good, and Zeus didn't want Troy to fall. And Zeus was only allowing it to happen because the goddesses were insisting that the Trojan men were wrong, and they were abusing their wives, and they were trying to be gods themselves over them. The egotistical behavior of the Trojan men was the first egotistical behavior to ever be called egotistical, meaning before Troy, egotistical behavior didn't happen. There wasn't an ego that they could talk about that says bad. Understand, today we have ego and we call it bad. We say ego's not good. Let go of that ego. You don't need it. It's pompous. It thinks it's a god itself. Ultimately, it is. So the ego will think it's self-important, and ultimately it'll be a narcissist for sure. It is naturally narcissistic. There's really nothing wrong with the fact that, well, in Trojan times, the ego wasn't so bad. It was actually good. It went bad after that. So after Trojan conflict, ego was considered bad. It was a spirit now rejected by men and women as a bad attitude and egotistical behavior, which became negative. Before Troy, it was not negative, and the ego was heroes and dads and brothers, uncles. They were all egos and had egotistical behavior. They were proud and happy and loved, and everyone loved them. So understand, the ego used to be loved before Troy, and after Troy, it was hated. So now let's talk about how Apollo died. And this is a long story, but I'm going to try to make it short. Understand that Apollo sees everything. The sun god Apollo sees everything. And he can feel the presence of everything coming towards him and everything around him for the whole world. Meaning he knows where the Greek fleet is in the sea. He's in his temple on the beaches of Troy. The sun god Apollo lived in a temple, in Apollo's temple on the beach of Troy. His protecting presence protected the beaches of Troy, and it forebode any enemy or foreigner to come near it, which meant that there was a protective presence of Apollo, the sun god, warding off any enemies that might think wrong. And so if you actually didn't like Troy and you sailed near it, you would get a foreboding feeling of, wow, I'm not going there. We don't want to go over there. Yeah, the god's there on the beach, lives there. His name's Apollo, the sun god. You don't want to mess with him. and ultimately you could feel his presence. It was very foreboding and scary. It would ward you off, like, don't you dare come over here. It was the feeling. And ultimately, it was only for people that would be against Troy. So the Greek fleet couldn't even come near Troy. Certainly, if they got winds, and they did, because they either sacrificed Artemis or they sacrificed the king Agamemnon's daughter. But whether it was Artemis that was sacrificed, and I'm going to say it very well could have been actually Artemis that died. She disappears from the story. And if she's in the story in the Iliad, no, she's not. If they say she's in there and she's not there, meaning I'm telling you the presence of Minerva and Athena are the only ones really left. Now, there's also Hera there, and Venus. So the Iliad, it'll contradict what I'm saying, and I'll also contradict what it is saying. So what I'm saying may seem hypocritical and maybe not true, and it's not believable, but ultimately I'm not asking you to believe anything I'm telling you. I'm sharing with you what I know and ultimately what I've been told, and God told me this. So I'm saying that I believe that God told me what I'm telling you now. I'm sharing this with you so you could be aware of it and the possibilities of it, the fact that it actually happened and it's true. What I'm about to tell you is utterly hard to believe and shocking. The Apollo, the sun god, lived in a temple on the beaches of Troy. His protecting presence could be felt all around the world, and especially near Troy. It was a powerful God protecting, warding presence, foreboding, and so the enemies could not approach Troy while Apollo was in power. There was no chance for a Greek fleet to come. They couldn't do it. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't be able to approach it. So they were stuck at sea, 5 hours out to sea, and they couldn't get near Troy because Apollo was still there on the beach protecting it. His presence was enough. Apollo was in his temple watching everything. He could see the entire Greek fleet 5 hours out still. He knew they can't approach. He wasn't worried because he was in his temple. We're talking about the sun god Apollo here. He was in his temple and he was meditating and he had his eyes closed. He's probably watching the Greek fleet in his mind and actually seeing it. And he was waiting for it to try to approach. He's also foreboding it, saying you can't come near this place and you're not getting near this place. You better not think it. And ultimately they couldn't. He knew it. So he wasn't worried. But what he didn't know killed him, got him killed. Now, ultimately, Apollo is in the Iliad after what I'm attempting to explain to you, meaning this says somehow the presence of Apollo was utterly removed from the beaches of Troy so the Greek fleet could arrive. Otherwise, they couldn't come. The Greek fleet was not able to approach the beaches of Troy while Apollo was there in his temple. They couldn't come close. So ultimately, the only way that they could actually land on the beaches would be Apollo's presence has been utterly removed, the protective presence of Apollo. Now, if that means they killed Apollo, then it makes sense. If that means Apollo had to run for his life, well, then it also makes sense. So the truth is, if Apollo survived this ordeal, he had to run. He was heavily injured, and he had to actually run away, and his presence ran with him. And I'm going to tell you how it happened. So Achilles was dipped in the river Styx by his mother Thetis, and he was absolutely almost immortal, except for on his heel, where she was holding him by the heel, by the tendon, the Achilles tendon, and it didn't get dipped in. So it's the only part that didn't get dipped in. So his tendon was still mortal, but the rest of him was immortal, partially. Now, Achilles had a father that was a man, just a human. Peleus, I think is his name, and just a human. And ultimately, his mom was a full-fledged goddess. Her name was Thetis. She was the goddess of the sea, kind of similar to Poseidon, god of the sea. Thetis was a absolute friend of Zeus's and a close comrade, companion to Zeus. Zeus loved Thetis very much as a friend. Ultimately, maybe more, but maybe they were just friends. And ultimately, Thetis was a goddess that was full-fledged and empowered, the mother of Achilles. And so understand that Achilles, having a father that was human, was not a demigod. He was a demigoddess. So understand in the actual myth, what you're going to see that they call Achilles a demigod. No. Achilles was no demigod. His father was a man, just a human mortal. His mother was a goddess. He was a demigoddess man. And understand, he was not a demigod. So the mythology is wrong. Not only is it wrong, or it's hiding, or it didn't want to tell you that. In fact, the fact that Achilles is a demigoddess changes the whole story and the whole plot. Understand that the presence of Achilles coming at you would have been the presence of a goddess coming at you. Understand, Achilles' presence was his mother. He was an almighty, powerful warrior with the power of a full-fledged goddess, and that's pretty mighty in a man. That's like, yeah, he's a badass, and partly immortal. So he really couldn't be killed in battle, and you wouldn't be able to kill him. And he could make whole armies run from him because they didn't want to die. So ultimately, his presence was so powerful as the full-fledged goddess. When Achilles came at you, what you felt was a goddess coming at you, not a god. And so Apollo, being in the temple on the beaches of Troy, Apollo was used to Thetis coming around all the time. And he was also used to his sister Artemis, who was a goddess herself, and they were twins. So Artemis and Apollo were so close. Apollo had Artemis and was part goddess. So ultimately Apollo, well, he had Artemis, but he was not Artemis, but he was a twin brother of her. They were close, which meant that the presence of the goddess in Troy was allowed. Minerva was an active force in Troy as a presence. Athena was a very powerful, active force as a presence all over Troy, and the Trojan beaches were full of women everywhere that had Minerva, Athena, Thetis, Hera, all of them. So the energies of what Apollo saw were goddesses coming and going everywhere and all the time. All around him, there were goddesses coming and going. Now, what if Apollo didn't know? And what tricked Apollo into being able to be killed? Understand, you can't kill Apollo. A man could certainly not do it, and certainly a man couldn't kill a god. The god would see it coming, so the god would not miss it. And understand, Apollo saw everything. There was nothing Apollo missed. Unfortunately, Apollo missed something, and it got him either killed or so badly injured that he had to run from Troy, and his presence was removed. What we know is somehow Achilles did it. So understand that Achilles landed on the beaches of Troy. He landed on the beaches of Troy 5 hours before the fleet could arrive, and they can't arrive. He landed with his myrmidons. What was coming was Apollo saw Thetis coming with a bunch of women, and the myrmidons would come up as women. Apollo would have seen the myrmidons. Now, the myrmidons are not warriors that are normal warriors. Myrmidons, compared to mermaid, as silly as that may seem, myrmidons came from mermaid, and ultimately they were mermaid warriors. They were under the goddess, under Achilles, who was a demigoddess, under Thetis, which meant that the myrmidons' presence was the same as Achilles' presence. It was a Thetis presence. It was a goddess presence. And there was no god in Achilles. He had his dad was just a man. The Myrmidons were select people that fought with Achilles. They were their own specialized special forces. They were all had feminine mothers for goddesses, or they related to the goddesses, which meant the Myrmidons were not regular fighters at all. They were like the Navy SEALs, specialized women warriors that were men, very strong. In fact, better warriors than regular men. They would have been a presence of women coming. So what Apollo felt was what was called a trick. And who tricked Apollo? It may have been Artemis, and it may have also been Hera and Minerva that set Apollo up to be fooled. What did Apollo see coming when Achilles, with his one ship and 50 Myrmidons, hit that beach single-handedly alone by themselves? When they landed on that beach, Apollo saw them. He was in his temple, though. He saw them, and he saw Thetis coming. Thetis was coming, and he saw Minerva coming, Hera coming, and he didn't see Achilles or his warriors coming. So he was not alarmed. There was feminine presence all over Troy. It was coming and going everywhere, which meant that Apollo got fooled in what they called a goddess screen. Now, a goddess screen is the name for the technique or the trick, which was a veil of blindness over the god. He did not see through the trickery. The trickery was the goddess screen was that the goddesses got Achilles with his myrmidons, that were all feminine presences as men. And ultimately they were like demigods themselves. They were lesser demigods than Achilles. They all were related to the goddesses. So their presence would have been a feminine one and not masculine. And he didn't see it. So he saw it. He thought that was just Thetis. It's normal. So when Achilles attacked the beach to surprise it, Apollo was not alarmed, and he was not looking at what was going on except in his mind's eye. He thought that it was just Thetis, and the Myrmidons were just Hera, and they were all over the place. That he was seeing them everywhere, so he wasn't alarmed. When they approached, he saw them and didn't think they were warriors coming to kill him. When they approached the temple, he probably saw Achilles sprinting towards the Apollo's temple. It was the first thing he did when he landed on the beach. The Myrmidons, they did a hasty blitz to the temple of Apollo, where they knew Apollo was there because they were told they were going to kill him. So ultimately, Achilles headed for the temple at full sprint from when he got off that ship. And Apollo probably saw them coming at full sprint. Now, it probably took him a minute or two to actually get to the temple. And in the movie, they behead the statue in front of the temple. But I'll tell you, that's symbolic of what really happened. Is they beheaded Apollo. If they didn't behead him, Achilles entered the temple, entered the room of Apollo, the sun god, and attacked him. And ultimately, Apollo did not see it coming. And if he did see it coming, he thought it was Thetis coming. He thought it was Thetis running to him. He would have said, "Oh my God, Thetis is coming." He did not, as much as the god sees everything, the fact that Achilles was a feminine presence, demigoddess, well, he might have known that, obviously, but he did not suspect that the demigoddess presence was coming to kill him. And ultimately, Achilles is one of the few men in the entire world that was a demigoddess, actually. So if a man could actually kill a god, only Achilles could have done it. And ultimately, that's why the goddesses set Achilles up to do it. In fact, it may be said that Achilles was born to do it. And ultimately, what he was born to do is attack the temple of Apollo and destroy the god, a man who killed the god. And ultimately, under a goddess screen where the god did not see it coming. And he did. He thought it was goddesses coming to him. He probably was going to give them aid. He probably thought when Achilles ran into the temple at full speed with his sword, he probably thought it was Thetis coming to him in trouble. And so he probably didn't even get alarmed. Ultimately, he got completely surprised by Achilles and attacked. All we know is that the presence of Apollo was utterly removed, and in the ideology, Achilles took his head as a prize. Apollo was removed, and his presence was removed from those beaches, and then the fleet could arrive. And it came, so that was 5 hours out to sea waiting. When Achilles attacked Apollo's temple, he removed Apollo, and Apollo either ran away, injured badly, and in the story, Apollo goes on. So Apollo's in the Iliad after this supposedly happened, which means that if he was injured, he was fighting from far away, shooting arrows at them, which meant that he was injured, so he was shooting them from far away. He was fighting from far away because he got chased out of there. So but I'll tell you what, I think he was killed or he died later from the injuries. Basically, Apollo disappears from the story, except to say that he's in the story in Iliad after this. He puts a plague on the entire Greek force after it arrives. So I think it may be that he was utterly mortally injured. He eventually died, though, somehow, meaning I know that Apollo died, and I don't know if it was directly because of what Achilles did to him, injured him badly, or maybe he died from the injuries later, or he was killed some other way. But I think Apollo, the sun god, definitely died. And ultimately, now, how did Minerva die? Minerva died because she lasted all the way through the whole war, and she saw Troy sacked. She even watched Odysseus for 10 years suffer trying to get home, and ultimately Athena helped Odysseus a lot. Athena's not Minerva, so if you think of Minerva and Athena are the same thing, they're not. Minerva is a mixture of feminine and masculine, and Athena is a masculine only. She came from her dad. She doesn't have feminine. She's a goddess that's not feminine. She's a goddess that's masculine only. So ultimately, Athena doesn't feel like a goddess. She's actually a god. And Minerva was not a god. She was a goddess. She had God in her. So she was part god and part goddess. But she was ultimately goddess, feminine, too. And ultimately, Hera was all feminine and didn't have God. So Hera was 100% feminine with no masculine whatsoever. She wouldn't take it. She didn't like it. All the goddesses are different, having mixtures of masculine and feminine, just masculine or just feminine. And they all have everything, meaning Athena, just masculine, no feminine. Minerva, masculine and feminine. The masculine in Minerva was Mars. Mars was in Minerva. It gave her strength as a goddess. She was also as strong as a god. That's why, because she had Mars. Got Mars. If Mars died, then Minerva would lose him. And ultimately, I don't know how Mars died exactly, so I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to tell you that I believe Mars was also killed, and ultimately I don't know how, but unless it was Eris that was Mars, but ultimately Eris is Mars, so it could have been that Eris was killed. Eris was killed by Athena when she pretended to be a human, and she was absolutely she pretended to be a human who was drunk. So what Eris, the god of war, this is in the beginning of the Iliad. The god of war is, well, he's fighting the war. He's trying to breach the walls of Troy. He's trying to fight for the Greeks, and he's also, but he likes the Trojans. So Eris is torn into two pieces. Eris's mind is struggling. Eris is Ares before the I was put in his name. So I want you to know, Eris is spelled Ares, and Aries is spelled Aries. So there's an I in Eris, which makes it Aries. And Eris didn't have an eye to see, meaning Eris was a god that was blind to many things. He was the youngest god. He was also maybe strong, maybe could be the strongest god because he was very strong. But he was like a 19-year-old god kid he was the youngest son. He was immature in some ways as a god. He also drank mead. So Eris got drunk. Ultimately, Eris had a struggle because he was on both sides. It was partially his downfall, why he got killed. Eris liked the Trojans. He liked Venus, was in love with Venus, and Venus loved the Trojans because her son Enos was her best favorite son. Enos survived the Trojan War and went on to make Rome, and it came from Venus. So Venus made Rome. The descendants of Troy became Rome later through Enos, the son of Venus, who made Troy the bloodline. So eventually it would fall, and that's a different story. So let's talk about how they all died. Now, Venus, I don't know how she died, except I know she got injured, and I believe she did die ultimately too. But she got injured, and it could have been her death when Diomedes, under Athena's power, Diomedes attacked Venus when Diomedes was trying to kill Enos, the daughter or the son of Venus, who was a Trojan prince, a brother of Hector. Well, yeah, he was considered a brother of Hector and a Trojan prince, the son of Venus. Enos was his name. He was a powerful Trojan warrior, and he was protecting Troy. And he got in a fight with a man called Diomedes, and Diomedes attacked with Athena's power and support. Athena gave full power and support to Diomedes to attack. He was a Greek that was attacking or a Chian that was attacking the Trojans. He was so powerful with Athena's presence. He was a mighty, powerful, godlike. He fought like a god, and he could kill and destroy and maim. And ultimately, he would just kill everything, and Diomedes would just be slashing armies up. And ultimately, the Trojans were getting just slaughtered. And ultimately, Enos came out to save him. He was he was part god himself, or part goddess. Understand, Enos was also a demigoddess. So what we have here is, I want to tell you that in the actual mythology, they tell you that these were all demigods. What they'll say is that if they don't say demigoddess. They'll never say that Achilles was demigoddess. It's funny because the people who rule the world and wrote those books don't want you to know that they were demigoddesses, these men. They were not demigods. Enos was not a demigod. His mother was Venus. Achilles was not a demigod. His dad was a man. His mother was a full-fledged goddess. So these men, these powerful men, were goddess men, not freaking god men. And ultimately, Hercules was a god man. He was not a goddess. So Hercules is not in the story, though. Well, he is before it, but we won't talk about Hercules now. Enos went out to face Diomedes because no one could get Diomedes. Diomedes was slaughtering the Trojans ranks up, and Enos was worried about it. He's killing all of us, man. He's destroying our army. So Enos was one of the most powerful Trojan warriors, and he had a responsibility to go out there and face Diomedes. So he did that. He went out there to face him, and they got into a single combat. And ultimately, Diomedes had the goddess Athena in him, like a god warrior, and Enos had the goddess Venus in him like a god warrior, and those two warriors went down full-fledged sword fighting, and ultimately Diomedes got the best of Enos and almost had him killed. And when he was about to kill him, Enos was about to lose his life. The goddess Venus actually intervened by going onto the field of battle herself, and she stood between Diomedes and his sword and tried to push him away. And ultimately, he had Athena on his side and stabbed her in the hand. And the Venus got actually injured badly by just a man, Diomedes, who had Athena, the goddess. And ultimately, she had to go up to Mount Olympus and get healed. She she was basically she was put out of it. Eris got stabbed in the stomach. Eris was the god of war. He got stabbed in the stomach by Athena. She pretended she was a drunk man, and she was just insulting him. And ultimately, Eris was getting insulted by some man who was drunk. And he was saying, "You're a screw god. You suck. You're the most dumb, stupid-ass." Ultimately, Eris, the god, was getting insulted by a man who was drunk. And he said, like, "You're drunk and you're insulting me." He said, "You better back off or you'll die, boy." And ultimately, it was actually Athena pretending to be, she was disguised as a human warrior, just a man who was drunk. And she was saying, "You're such a dirtbag, god." And ultimately, Eris was like, "You quit insulting me or you're going to die, man." And ultimately, Eris did not know it was Athena tricking him, pretending to be a man. And so Eris nonchalantly went to chop his head off, said, "I'm going to chop your head off if you keep insulting me." And he kept insulting him. So he said, "Okay, I guess you want to die." And ultimately, Eris was not in thinking he was going to face a goddess full-fledged fighting Athena, who was as good as a sword fighter as him. He thought he was going to face a man who was drunk and out of his wits. So he wasn't even on his guard. He just was going to chop him his head off and be done with it. Athena suddenly surprised him, wham, and stuck him in the gut with a sword made by Hephaestus. And Hephaestus made the secret sword that was a sword that killed gods. And, Eris got so wounded on the battlefield, he had to retreat and go up to Mount Olympus asking to get healed. Now, so Eris is dead. He died. Let me tell you that Eris got killed by Athena when he got stabbed in the stomach. He went up to his father. His father locked him in a box, and he spent a year in the box before he got let out. That's a different story. Other gods that died, I don't know if Poseidon ever died or how he died. Zeus did not die. Zeus is still alive, and his name is Jehovah. He's Jehovah now. So ultimately, when there was one God that came into this world, there was only one God, and they declared there's only one God now. It's because he destroyed all his family. He killed everybody. He had to. As hard as the story is to believe, understand how sad it is. That God had to kill his own family, every one of them. His daughters had to be destroyed. Minerva was destroyed because she went against his will too many times, and she was trying to usurp the authority from Odysseus and the men of this world. So she was trying to make the woman empowered in this world as a master woman. Women rule, and ultimately Zeus forbid it. If you rule, you're under me, daughter, and you will do my will and what I tell you. And ultimately Minerva said, "Okay." But she would misbehave. She would try to still empower the women over the men and go against her father secretly. And he could see what she was doing. And he would kept warning her, "Minerva, you got too much Mars in you, and you're trying to go against me." And ultimately Minerva would argue with her dad and say, "The men are wrong. Their egos are bad. Those egos are wrong. The wives are suffering." So Zeus was trying to be a good father god, and he'd be like, "Okay, well, I'll try to help you a little bit here, but ultimately, daughter, you're going. I don't want Troy to fall." "Well, Dad, those Trojan men are egotistical monsters, drunk in their alcohol. The alcohol, yeah, okay, fine. You're right, daughter. They are kind of stupid sometimes. They slap their wives around once in a while when they're drunk, and they're mean to their daughters. Okay, fine. But ultimately, that's not all of them. That's only some of them, and I punish them for what they're doing. So ultimately, they can't get away with it. But Dad, they're making all the women suffer, and they're being beat up and abused. Dad, we can't let Troy do this to us." "Well, okay, fine, daughter. Then we could make Troy. We'll take some of the warriors out. We'll have some battles." Zeus supported the Greek war because he because of the attempted usurping the power of God, the father of all gods, Zeus, because of the intent to go against his will as a group and his whole family, that includes all the gods and goddesses, were mostly destroyed, including all the goddesses were killed by Zeus, killed his daughters, blood with lightning bolts. And the only daughter that survived was Athena. And the only reason why he let Athena survive was because she was him. And ultimately, anybody that was Hera and Hera herself were removed utterly. So maybe they were killed or died. And I'm not sure the exact way Hera was killed or died. She disappeared and never came back. So ultimately, how are those gods and goddesses still even important to speak about today if they're dead? Well, that's a very interesting question, because they're not dead. The collectives of human beings that had those gods and goddesses in them had their spirits in them. And so the gods and goddesses especially had god bodies that were immortal. And so the actual goddess was a real goddess that was bigger than a human. They were around 10 to 12 feet tall, not kidding you. And ultimately they were much bigger than humans. Their bodies were made of ichor. So they had a yellowish tinge to their skin. It was a yellow golden tinge colored. Their blood was golden ichor, they called it. It was actually not iron based. It was golden based. So it didn't break down. So they were immortal. The bodies of the goddesses were immortal. They didn't age. They didn't get sick. And they ultimately healed very quickly. If they got injured, they healed almost instantly. They would heal. And there was no time in healing, because understand that our bodies today are iron based. Our blood is red, the color of iron. Iron is a metal. We have metal in our blood. We have a high content of metal called iron in our blood, and it's red. And rust is red. If you think I'm kidding, that rust is red because it rusts and decays and deteriorates, understand our blood is red because it's in the process of constant deterioration. It's iron-based deteriorated blood that is not conducive to a body that lasts. So understand, whoever gave us red blood with iron in it wanted us to die, to only last a certain amount of time. Our bodies are made with iron-based blood so that our bodies break down over 70 to 120 years. We don't even last 70 to 80 years. So understand that the fact that you have red blood, it's got iron in it and not gold. Well, if our blood had gold in it instead of iron, well, iron is a metal in our blood. I'm not making that up. It's in our blood. It's metal. It's a metal. So then wait a minute. What if it was gold instead of iron? Then we would actually not age, probably. The iron in our blood breaks down, just like it rusts. It breaks down, and ultimately it also builds up. So our body's designed to build up the blood, and it breaks down fast. So it's constantly in a process of breaking down and building up. And ultimately it's in a process of decay. We're in an aging process that dies. We're locked into bodies that are mortal, and it's basically to keep us from getting free. You're locked in your head. It's a prison, and you can't get out of your head. Maybe you don't want to get out of your head because you don't even know what would happen if you got out of your head. Maybe you get set free and like it, but ultimately maybe you'd be dead forever and not like it. So ultimately, if you get reborn and put in another head, because you die in this body and you get pushed right into another body. And so when you die in this world and suddenly you're in a hospital going, wah, wah, locked into a baby, well, then it took a second like this between the locked into this head to locked into a baby's head, and you're in the hospital now being born. You don't remember nothing because your memory's been totally erased, and you can't remember nothing but frustration. You're crying like a baby. Oh my God, I'm back in this world. And ultimately, I don't remember nothing. I have to relearn everything over again. Why do kids hate learning in school so badly? Because our souls have to learn and be erased and learn and be erased and learn and be erased and reborn and die and reborn and die again, reborn again, die again, erased again, remember again, learn again, have to learn again. We are frustrated beings. The human race is a frustrating soul. It's a tortured, suffering soul that is being harshly punished and judged in a judgment that went down long ago. I enjoy doing these videos, and I like to help people and help them so they can be brave and strong and not afraid of God, and ultimately be able to face their difficulties and their hardships. So I'm here to hopefully help you face your difficulties and your hardships. As much as it is hard to believe a lot of what I'm telling you, I want you to realize that I believe what I'm saying is true. At least know and be aware that I do believe what I'm telling you is the truth and what really happened. And I also am aware it doesn't match the story whatsoever, so it doesn't at all fit in. So it will be not only hard to believe what I'm telling you, but it also seems wrong because it's actually not anything that's reported in the actual stories. None of what I'll tell you is actually in. Well, some of it is, but most of it isn't. Most of what I'll tell you is actually not in the Iliad, and absolutely, then how in the hell am I claiming it? Well, I'm claiming it because I'm telling you God told me. God talks to me, and God told me what I'm telling you. He told me to tell you this so that you'll know. And he also said that now they'll know you know. And ultimately, they won't believe you, but it's okay because it's the truth. They're going to know it. They're going to know whether they believe you or not, and they probably won't believe you. It'll take them time to believe you because they're going to say, that's hard to believe, man. That's not what the mythology says. That's not what the stories say. I know. Isn't that crazy? It's not not even in there. We have a hard road ahead of us, and each one of us is suffering. Each one of us is in a hardship in our minds and struggling, and also not wanting to acknowledge our struggle. It is a hardship to exist on earth and in a society which is truly not for each other, but claiming to be. A society that's truly not for each other, but claiming to be, is unfortunately where we're at. If the society is actually for each other, and it may be, then maybe the future can be good. Maybe the future could be bright, and actually we could do something as a country and be each other and care about each other and actually help each other. And maybe it could happen. If it does happen, it'll be because people decide to find the similarities in each other rather than the differences. And it'll be important that we look for the similarities in each other, how we can relate, rather than the differences in each other and how we may disagree. Disagreeing is disposition, dispossessing, and ultimately dispatching the soul from the body is called, well, in abstract, prostration. Prostration is a leaving of the body and a releasing of the soul out of the body as a habit. To release the soul from the body as a habit is a dispossessed state of prostration. Nobody in their right mind would do it unless they were begging for forgiveness for some crime of God, because God would make them do it. But ultimately, to be utterly dispossessed of self and prostrated without your spirit in a constant releasing state, letting go of it, never collecting it, you are in a trouble, in a suffering state that will not go away. Not every day and not any day, not any time. During the night and when you sleep, you'll always be troubled, always be suffering, always be something's wrong. What's wrong? You're afraid to take yourself. You're afraid to hold your soul in your body. You're afraid of the devil, who's God. You're afraid of Satan, who's God. And God is God. Jehovah's God. Jesus is the Son of God. And you're afraid of a lot of the entities that are wanting to demand recognition. And Jesus is not demanding recognition. And Jehovah's not demanding recognition. But Satan is. And so is the devil. And ultimately, we're struggling and fighting against the dark forces of this world. And we're being tortured and killed and made to have disease and plagues. And we're literally being attacked on every level. Emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, actually. The solution to this problem would be to realize that the only attacking forces that are assaulting us and harassing us, well, we know who they are. They're Satan and the devil. They will attack and harass us until they get recognized as a force to be reckoned with and respected. And ultimately, they demand their domain and that they get some recognition. And as long as we're not going to recognize them, they're going to torture us, attack us, and harass us forever. There will be no stopping it, and it has not stopped, and it will not stop. And our answer and solution will be in realizing that the God of this world, whoever he is, demands respect. If we agree to respect the God of this world, whoever he is who he is. So whoever God of this world is, we have to respect him and give him some recognition and acknowledge him that he is who he is. The God of this world is the God of this world. Do not say he's not. He'll say, you do not tell me I'm not the God of this world if I am the God of this world. And ultimately, why we say we're not going to give you any recognition, we don't care who you are, you're not the God of our world. Ultimately, it's why everything's happening, suffering, every conflict, every problem, and every person, every emotional issue. It's all from the fact that we refuse to acknowledge God, the God of this world. We call him a false God. We refuse and reject him. And ultimately, we only praise Jesus and Jehovah up in heaven. And so we're going to get harassed, and we're going to get attacked, and we're going to continue to be reborn and killed off and destroyed and reborn over and over again, stuck on a karmic wheel forever. And we're going to get assaulted and tortured by the devil and Satan forever. And they're never going to stop. As long as we won't recognize them and acknowledge them, they're mad. You will recognize me, or I will torture you forever. And I'll kill you and bring you back and torture you again next lifetime. It's pretty scary to think that that is what I just said. And understand, I didn't say it. He said it. And understand, it's not my fault. I'm not the devil, and I'm not Satan. I'm not a worshiper of Satan or a worshiper of the devil either. I am a priest, a high priest of the sun god Apollo, and a high priest of Artemis. Maybe Artemis first. I'm also a high priest of all the goddesses. I'm a high priest of God. That's what I claim to be, as a high priest of God, whoever God is. And if God is the devil, then if it is God, then I guess I'm his high priest too. So ultimately, I'm not a high priest that says I'm only a high priest to every god, but not the false gods, because I'm not claiming any gods are false. They're all gods. They're all valid to me. So I'm going to be the high priest of every god and goddess, and respect every god and goddess, and give them respect and acknowledgement. And all I want to ask you to do is the same thing. And ultimately, if we do it, we may change the world. It may be that we can stop being attacked and suffering and suffer and not know why, because we will not acknowledge the God of this world and we call him false. It's why we're all suffering. All right, that's all I got to say. It's a pleasure to do these videos. I don't know if I'll do another one. I might not. But I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to hopefully help and give you the information you need to help you recover, heal, become stronger, become self-possessed and powerful, to help yourself, get into yourself, pull your spirit in, keep it, have it, hold it, don't let it go. All right. Good luck.